Hey listeners, this is Peter, and welcome back to the History Shorts. This humble show is brought to you by the Podcast Republic, your ultimate listening app. Discover and subscribe to thousands of podcasts from around the globe, yours truly included, and all in one place. Download Podcast Republic now, available on Google Play and the Apple App Store. Today on History Shorts. The summer of 1924 began like any other in Tehran. Dusty, hot, and restless. But by mid-July, the city would be gripped by violence. When an American diplomat named Robert Whitney Imbrie was beaten to death by a mob in broad daylight, it sent shockwaves through both Persia, as Iran was known at the time, and the United States. What seemed at first like a spontaneous act of religious fury soon revealed deeper political tensions. The kind that would echo for a century to come. The murder of Robert Imbrie became more than just a tragedy. It became a symbol of the uneasy relationship between America and Iran, a relationship still marked, even today, by suspicion, misunderstanding, and competing visions of modernity and faith. And here is the rest of that story.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
To understand the Imbrie affair, you have to picture Persia in the early 1920s, a country in flux, caught between past and future. For centuries, Persia had been ruled by the Qajar dynasty, but by the turn of the 20th century, it was collapsing under the weight of corruption, foreign meddling, and lost territory. Both Britain and Russia had carved out spheres of influence, controlling railways, oil, and trade. When the Bolshevik Revolution erupted in 1917, Russia's influence suddenly receded, leaving a somewhat of a power vacuum that ambitious Persians sought to fill. Among them was Reza Khan, a soldier in the Persian Cossack Brigade, a man with the ambition and iron will to seize control of the nation's destiny. In 1921, he staged a coup, marching into Tehran at the head of his troops. Within months, he was Minister of War, then Prime Minister, and the de facto ruler of Persia. Reza Khan's message was very clear. The old order had failed, and he would build a new, modern Persia, strong, secular, and centralized. But beneath the surface of his reforms lay resentment, fear, and distrust, especially towards foreigners. And in this tense, charging landscape, the United States was, well, a newcomer. Unlike Britain and Russia, America had no colonial claims in Persia. That made it, at least in theory, a neutral and even sympathetic presence. American advisors like Morgan Schuster and Arthur Millspaugh had been invited to help reform Persia's finances. Missionaries had built schools and hospitals. By the early 1920s, the American flag flying over Tehran symbolized something unusual, the possibility of friendship without any domination. But that idealism was very fragile. The Persian public saw little difference between British agents, Russian spies, and American diplomats. To many, a foreigner was synonymous with a meddler. And so when Vice Consul Robert Whitney Imbrie arrived in Tehran, he entered a country simmering with tension. Robert Imbrie was not your typical bureaucrat, however. Born in 1883, he studied law, but adventure drew him abroad. Before joining the State Department, he had worked as a journalist and served in Russia and Turkey, places where danger was part of the job description. He was curious, fearless, and deeply interested in the cultures that he encountered. In Tehran, he spent his free time photographing shrines, markets, and street scenes, not out of disrespect, but really out of fascination. Yet that curiosity and his camera would prove deadly. In the summer of 1924, rumors spread across Tehran of a miracle working well. said to have healing powers, perhaps even divine origins. Crowds flocked to it, bringing the sick and the blind, hoping for cures. Authorities, alarmed by the growing frenzy, tried to restrict access, but that only made things worse. Religious passion mixed with political anger, and soon the well became a lightning rod for unrest. It was a volatile moment, one in which rumor carried more power than truth. And in that environment, a foreigner with a camera was a spark just waiting to ignite the powder keg. On the morning of July 18th, 1924, Robert Imbrie set out with an American missionary nurse named Melvin Seymour to photograph the well. No harm done, right? Well, they arrived to find a restless crowd. People whispered that foreigners were mocking the miracle, that they were spies or blasphemers. Seymour later recalled how the mood turned suddenly dark. Angry voices rose, hands reached for stones, and then the crowd surged. They were trapped. The first blows fell quickly. Stones struck Imbrie and Seymour as they tried to retreat. Seymour managed to break free, bloodied but alive. Imbrie was not so lucky. The mob dragged him down, beating him with fists, clubs, and iron rods. Soldiers eventually intervened, forcing the attackers back and loading the half-conscious Imbrie into a carriage, supposedly to bring him to safety. But then something went wrong. Instead of taking him to the American consulate or a secure facility, the carriage was directed to a religious hospital, controlled by clerics, and the mob followed. In the courtyard of that hospital, before horrified witnesses, Imbrie was beaten again. He died right there, alone and far from home. His body shattered by a fury he had neither caused nor really understood. When the news reached the American consulate, the horror was indescribable. An American diplomat had been murdered in the capital of a country that claimed to be America's friend. Washington demanded answers. The killing of Robert Imbrie made headlines across the world. In the United States, newspapers splashed the story right across the front pages. And I quote some of these. You could find them at newspapers.com. U.S. Consul beaten to death by mob in Persia. Missionary injured, government silent. Editorials demanded justice. Some even called for military action. In Tehran, Reza Khan faced a crisis that threatened everything he had built. On one hand, he needed to prove that he could control his own capital and protect foreign diplomats. But on the other hand, he couldn't appear to be bowing to foreign pressure. He chose a middle path: swift arrests, highly publicized trials, and several executions. But few believed the story was that simple. Whispers spread that a mob had been incited, either by Reza Khan's enemies, hoping to embarrass him, or perhaps even by his own allies, eager to create a pretext for a crackdown. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. The incident showcased both the fragility of Reza Khan's control and the willingness to use violence to strengthen it. The American consulate, led by Minister Joseph Kornfeld, pressed the Persian government hard. Washington demanded reparations, formal apologies, and public punishment of the guilty. Reza Khan complied, at least on the surface. He paid an indemnity to Imbrie's widow and then staged an official funeral for the slain diplomat. In photographs from the day, which again you could find on newspapers.com, Persian soldiers stand solemnly beside Imbrie's flag-draped coffin, a gesture meant to project dignity and remorse. But behind the ceremony lay unease. For the Persian elite, the killing was a humiliation. For the clerics and the street mobs, the executions that followed only deepened resentment against the Americans. And for Reza Khan, the entire episode became a justification for his next step, which was consolidating absolute power. The message he sent to Persians and foreigners alike was very clear. Only I can impose order on this country. In Washington, the reaction was mixed. The U.S. government had little appetite for intervention, but it couldn't ignore the death of one of its diplomats. President Calvin Coolidge, who had just succeeded the late Warren Harding, approved a formal protest and accepted the indemnity. The State Department quietly pulled back its personnel, weary of further violence. Public opinion was much more volatile, however. American newspapers painted Persia as a primitive, lawless, and consumed by fanaticism. Some editorials demanded that the United States cut ties entirely. Others saw the event as proof that America should become more involved to bring modernization and stability to the backward land, and I quote. Both views missed the complexity of Persia's turmoil. But the damage was done. Trust had been broken, and suspicion took its place. In the months after the murder, Reza Khan used the unrest, as I mentioned, to his advantage. He argued that Persia needed a strong ruler to prevent any further chaos, not a weak monarch bound by old traditions. The following year, in 1925, he deposed the last Qajar Shah and crowned himself Reza Shah Pahlavi. Under his rule, Persia would begin a rapid, often brutal transformation. New schools, new roads, new armies, and the suppression of the clergy and traditional elites. But the memory of the Imbrie affair lingered, a warning that foreign presence could ignite domestic fury in unpredictable ways. For decades, Western diplomats in Iran would remember the name Imbrie as shorthand for what could happen when idealism collided with a revolution. Back in the United States, Robert Whitney Imbrie was buried with full honors at Arlington National Cemetery. His funeral in August of 1924 was attended by officials, fellow diplomats, and grieving family. The State Department hailed him as a martyr to duty, a man who gave his life in the service of peace. But in time, his name faded from the headlines. Even when I was looking for topics to talk about today, this one kind of popped out of nowhere. As I started reading about it, I said to myself, I never heard of this before. Maybe my listeners haven't either. When Americans think of Iran, or even when they later thought of Iran after this event, they thought of oil nationalization in the 1950s, the CIA-backed coups in 1953, or the hostage crisis in 1979. That's the way I myself taught it for years in a high school classroom. Imbrie's death became a footnote. I never heard about it until doing this research, overshadowed by later crises. Yet in many ways, his story was a preview of them all. A collision of faith and modernization, nationalism and foreign influence. The same themes that would define U.S.-Iranian relations for the entire next century. Nearly 100 years later, the Imbrie affair remains a little-known chapter, but one that captures the essence of Iran's struggle in the 20th century, a country caught between reform and tradition, modernity and identity, self-determination and foreign pressure. For the United States, it was an early lesson in how fragile alliances can be when cultural understanding is very shallow and diplomacy walks hand in hand with pride. For Iran, it became one more scar in a long history of suspicion toward outsiders, a story that begins with violence and ends with control. Well, and for Robert Imbrie himself, it was a story of courage and curiosity, a man who sought to understand a nation and its culture, and paid for it with his life. If today's episode inspired you in any way, you can find sources, links, and upcoming guest announcements at www.historyshortspodcast.com or follow History Shorts Podcast on Facebook and X. Stay curious, and I'll talk to you all tomorrow.